So today we're going to talk about Kripke and his assault on the paradigm for analytic philosophy. So the latest incarnation of analytic philosophy that we've been looking at is logical empiricism. And it shares with other versions of analytic philosophy a desire for precision, the priority of linguistic analysis for addressing philosophical questions. In fact, it leaves no room for philosophical investigation except in the form of linguistic analysis of key terms, key propositions, key theories. All of that gets challenged by Kripke. So at the heart of the logical empiricist, logical positivist picture of the world is an aligning of three important sets of distinctions. The distinction between the analytic and the synthetic. Think of that as a philosophy of language distinction. The distinction between a priori and a posteriori knowledge, that's pretty clearly an epistemological distinction, and the distinction between what's necessary and what's contingent, or what's merely possible. Those are distinctions within metaphysics. And the logical empiricists had a clean picture of the relationship between the three of these. They identified the analytic with the necessary, with what's knowable a priori. And they identified the synthetic with what's contingent or merely possible, and that together with the a posteriori. Kripke initiates the challenge of this way of aligning things, and in the process undermines the attempt to make linguistic analysis have primacy over either the epistemology or the metaphysics. So remember, if we draw the three circles that I've been focusing on during this course, mind, world, and language, the relationships between them for analytic philosophers starts in the language circle. And then we derive metaphysical conclusions on the basis of logical form. And then from there, we can go on to investigate the connections between mind and world in the form of philosophy of mind and epistemology. And there's a nice term that has been introduced for people who approach philosophy in these ways, or at least this part of philosophy. So remember, I've said, I keep forgetting which I said. The heart of philosophy is mind, world, and language and the interrelationships between those. The soul of philosophy is the good life and the normative dimension of reality. But if you go to the heart place, it turns out the central things to think about and theorize about there involve language, epistemology, metaphysics, and mind. And people who work on all four, which is pretty much everybody who's important in this part of philosophy since Kripke, is called a lemming. And David Lewis is the premier lemming philosopher. So lemming is L-E-M-M for language, epistemology, metaphysics, and mind. And those form the four core areas that need theorizing about when you're thinking about the relationships between mind, world, and language. So let's take a look at Kripke, and Kripke's investigation starts at a place that we noticed in the conversations between Ruth Barkin Marcus and Quine, Willard Van Orman Quine. So the first question is, are there contingent identities? Along with Quine, most people thought, well, obviously, maybe there are necessary identities, but there are obviously cases of contingent identity. The morning star and the evening star, Phosphorus and Hesperus, Scott and the author of Waverley, heat and mean molecular motion, the inventor of bifocals, the source of the Saturday Evening Post, both of those turn out to be Ben Franklin, Gaurisankar and Mount Everest, Cicero and Tully, and even mind and brain. So notice with the last one, you get an explicit endorsement of a certain kind of identity theory of the mind that's physicalist in character. Now, if the thought is that mind and brain have to be necessarily identical, You run into problems if you're a logical empiricist. You run into problems if you think what's basic is analyticity, and necessity just comes along free for the ride once you defend analytic connections. So physicalist conceptions of the mind underwent a serious problem, a serious downturn in their popularity, to the extent that the relationship between mind and brain couldn't be analytic and thus couldn't be necessary unless you could affirm that, no, really, there is an identity here. It's just a contingent identity. All right, so the consensus seemed to be there are contingent identities. But take a look here at, I wonder if I can get this entire proof on, yeah, there we go, good. It straddles a page, but there you go. I hope you can see the whole thing. So start out with the claim that identical objects share their features. That's what claim 1 says. For all x and y, if x and y are identical, then any feature of f is also a feature of y. Now, suppose that's true. Second claim, x is necessarily self-identical. For all x, every x is necessarily self-identical. So this is an important point, and I want to point out to you the basis for it. So let me see if I can get my crappy writing instrument up. In first order logic, A equals A is a theorem. It's a theorem because in first order logic, it's impossible to have a model for a first order language that has an empty domain. The domain has to have something in it. And for whatever is in it, if you have a constant in your language, it's going to have to be assigned something in the domain. And you can't make an object not be identical to itself. Now, one of the most fundamental principles of modal logic is called the rule of necessitation. For any claim, this is the sequent symbol. It means this claim is derivable from the stuff that precedes the sequence symbol. In the case of a theorem, what follows the sequence symbol is derivable from nothing at all. That's what it is to be a theorem. So this is a theorem. And the first principle, one of the first principles of modal logic, is called the rule of necessitation. It says, if phi is a theorem, then so is fox phi. So one way to think about this is, if phi is a theorem, then phi is a logical truth. It's a logical truth because no matter what you put in as your premises, even if you put in nothing, you're still going to be able to derive this. So it's a logical truth. And the claim is, if it's a logical truth, then so is the claim that it's necessary. Logical truths are necessary. And so anything that's a logical truth, its necessity should also be derivable from nothing at all and hence be a theorem. All right, now come back to the claim A equals A. That, we said, is a theorem. So if it's a theorem, so is its necessity. All that's left to get us from here to line 2 is just to universally generalize on the name in question. Now, you can't always do this. You can only do it when the name in question is arbitrary. And if you have taken logic and remember what it was like, there are restrictions introduced on universal introduction to ensure that the name you're generalizing on was arbitrary. In other words, that you could have run the same reasoning sequence no matter what name you put in there. And that's pretty obviously true because it doesn't matter at step one of this argument what constant you put in place of A. If you put in A equals A, you get a theorem. If you put B equals B in, you get a theorem. If you put C equals C in, you get a theorem. It makes no difference what constant you put in there. So the name that we have selected at step one, A, really is an arbitrary name. You could have put any other name you wanted in its place and it would have been okay. And then no matter what name you put in there, if you get a theorem, you get to box it. So step two is fine. We get to box A equals A. And now we notice the constant we picked really is an arbitrary constant. The same line of reasoning would have worked regardless of what name we put in. So we get to generalize on the name. When we do so, that gives us line 2. Okay, so 2 steps so far. One is the things that are identical share all their features, and necessary self-identity, that's not the right way to say that. The necessity of being identical with yourself is something that everything has. Even if there are contingent identities, self-identity is not contingent. Okay, let's go with that. We're now down to step 2. Now something really fancy occurs in the next step. So I want to go slowly. It turns out step 3 is just a substitution instance of 1. So let's see how. Notice, same 2 quantifiers to begin 1 and 3, same antecedent for both. And then what's different is this stuff. So something about this back part of line 3 involves a substitution instance for line 1. And notice the arrow is the same. Notice we've got an X in the part that comes before the arrow, and we have a Y that comes after the arrow. What's left? Well, what's left is this, which is the same both before and after the arrow. So it's that part that counts as the value for F in the back part of 3 as an instance of 1. So this box X equals is really our value for F. And what it says is X has a certain property F. Up here, X, any F you wanted could go in there. So here's the value for X that we're going to put in there. The value for X is being necessarily identical to X. Now, if X has the property of being necessarily identical to X, so does Y. Y has the property of being necessarily identical to X. So that's how line 3 counts as a substitution instance of line 1. All right, now notice this part. According to line 2, that's a necessary truth, and in fact, it's a logical truth. So it can just be dropped out of the picture. It won't affect the truth value of line 3 at all. And notice that's precisely what line 4 does. From 2 and 3, the middle part gets dropped, and so we end up saying for all X and Y, if X is identical with Y, then it's necessarily identical with Y. In other words, identity is always necessary. There are no such things as contingent identities. All right, so that's the quick, simple, easy proof from Kripke as to why identity has to be necessary. Now, if you're somebody like Quine who thinks, oh, you're just working too hard to purify the universe, what are you going to say about this argument? If you go back to our list of things that were supposed to be examples of contingent identities. Notice there's a lot here, a lot to work with to claim you don't have the right examples in order to form identity statements. So remember, Marcus said, really, you have to have individuals in identity statements. Maybe what she means is you have to have names, which fits with what Russell was doing it on denoting. Descriptions are not names; they do not denote. So you don't end up with identity claims between names and descriptions or between various descriptions. You have to actually have names. So there's one. Phosphorus and Hesperus are names. B is the only one so far. We do have a name in C, but not the other part of it. These aren't names at all. No names in here. Here we have two names. Here we have two names. And mind and brain aren't names. So do you really think the identity of Cicero and Tully is contingent? Is that supposed to be a contingent identity? Now, it is contingent that the individual in question has these names. I mean, you can call anything whatever you wish. That's about assigning names to individuals. But that would be a use mention confusion to confuse Tully with the person who is named Tully. When I use the word Tully, I'm talking about Tully. When I mention the word Tully, I'm talking about something that adverts to the giving of a name to a person by some group of people at some time, but that's not the same. So if you're a fan of contingent identity, you're going to have to say something here. And you can eliminate a whole bunch of contingent candidates for contingent identity by insisting, as Marcus does, that you have to actually have names in the sentences, names that are used in order to have a real identity claim. But then if you're a fan of contingent identity, you're going to have to claim Hesperus and Phosphorus are identical, but they didn't have to be. You're going to claim Cicero and Tully are identical, but they don't have to be. Now think of that. I mean, it's true that Cicero, the guy, didn't have to be named Tully, but that's a use mention confusion. So what are you going to say to defend that this is really an identity and nonetheless contingent? Well, it is an identity. It is one and the same person picked out by Cicero, by the word Cicero and by the word Tully. The referent of this word is the very same as the referent of this word. And then it looks like Kripke's argument should convince you, well, then it's a necessary identity. Cicero is identical to Tully and necessarily so. What will you balk at? Well, it turns out 1 and 2 are the only places to stop this argument, because 3 is just a simple substitution instance. And if you've already given in and granted 2, you can get from 3 to 4 very easily. So you better balk at this, or you better balk at this. Now, of those 2, the hardest one to balk at is this. And the reason that's the hardest one to balk at is because of the explanation I gave you as to why it's true. It is true because A equals A is a theorem. Now, in order to get from this to 2 itself, I had to do 2 things. One is I had to be able to box it. And then I had to universally generalize. Now, this step, nobody's going to balk at because that's a theorem of first order logic. So people like Klein, who are fans of contingent identities, that's not where they're going to stop things. Because then, who knows? I mean, what are you going to do? Start over with a different logic? I don't know what you're going to do. The second, and they're not going to balk at the generalization step either, because again, that's just a first order logic rule of inference that they've already committed themselves to. So it's going to have to be at the second step. And that one, it turns out, is questionable, or at least controversial a little bit. It's called the rule of necessitation. What it says is any theorem of first order logic corresponds to that theorem in its boxed version in modal logic. And the worry is if you adopt a variable domain semantics, then A doesn't need to exist in every world. So let A be the name Cicero, and then you assign an object in the domain to that name, namely Cicero. You assign Cicero as the denotation of the name Cicero. But Cicero doesn't exist in every world. But then you box the claim and you say, necessarily, Cicero is identical with Cicero. Well, when you box a claim, what you're saying is, here's a truth in every world. And then you ask yourself, okay, I'm in a world where there's no Cicero. No Cicero. Is it still true in this world that Cicero is identical to Cicero? If you're squeamish about that, if you say, no, not really, it can't be true in that world because there's no Cicero in that world. If that's the way you think about it, then you're going to want to put some restrictions on this rule of necessitation. You're going to want to say, well, A equals A can't be false in any world where A exists. But it's not boxed. It's not boxable because there are worlds in which A equals A is not true because there is no A. All right, now that's a fancy way of resisting this argument. Some people feel compelled to go that way, but they're not people like Quine who are fans of contingent identity. They're fans of modal logic. And they're just thinking we have to do the metaphysics derived from the formal system carefully, and we don't want C equals C to come out true in worlds where there isn't any C. All right, so that's a bit of a complication here, but that's not the significant one. The significant one is this one, the substitutivity of identity. So some people will say, look, there are some values for F for which line one is true, but there's others for which it's questionable. So let's take a simple example. Clark Kent is Superman. Now, which sentence is true? Lois Lane loves Clark Kent. Lois Lane loves Superman. Now, you know Lois Lane loves Superman, but it's a little awkward to say she loves Clark Kent. She kind of thinks he's a doofus. So maybe you don't want to agree to that substitution instance. Or maybe you want to say, no, she really does love Clark Kent. She just doesn't understand that that's the Superman that she's in love with. So she's ignorant of that fact. Okay, make it an even more subjective idea. Make the idea be, well, who is Lois Lane thinking about right now in this adoring mood? Is she thinking about Clark Kent or is she thinking about Superman? Is she wishing that Superman is with her, or is she wishing Clark Kent would come save her? Well, nobody wishes Clark Kent would come save them. Superman's the superhero. He's the guy who comes to the rescue, not Clark Kent. So you might have qualms about conditions under which substitutivity of identities can be done. And so you might say some contexts are transparent enough where you can do the substitutivity of identicals, but there are other opaque contexts where you can't do the substitution. And Lois Lane's ignorance that Clark Kent really is Superman creates just such an opaque context. So maybe the substitutivity principle is questionable enough because some contexts are opaque contexts that you should be asking whether identity itself, descriptions of identity, are themselves opaque contexts. If that's true, then you might resist the Kripke argument. But for now, let's just take the argument as it stands. It's an extremely powerful argument, and if there's something wrong with it, you're going to have to tell a really fancy story. All right, now once you do that, you started out with the idea, some people did, there can be contingent identities, and then you just learned, nope, there can't be. Or at least if you accept the proof, you learned, no, there can't be. So the question is, what goes wrong on this list? We had a list of things that we thought might contain examples of contingent identities. And now we have learned there can't be any such thing. How can you tell when an is statement that sounds like it's the is of identity really is the is of identity? Kripke has an answer. He says there's a simple intuitive test that you can apply for determining whether a term is the right kind of term to be used in an identity statement. Here's the test. We can say, for example, that the number of planets might have been a different number from the number it in fact is. For example, there might have been only 7 planets. We can say that the inventor of bifocals might have been someone other than the man who in fact invented bifocals. We cannot say, though, that the square root of 81 might have been a different number from the number it in fact is. For that number just has to be 9. All right, now the simple intuitive test, I think, got corrupted by the examples that Kripke used here. Because notice the cases where we have what he calls non-rigid designation involve empirical examples. And the case that involves rigid designation does not involve empirical examples. It instead involves a mathematical object. The number 9. I think that makes it harder to follow what's going on. So I think he would have been better off to use the Nixon example to convince us that on a simple intuitive test, the number of planets, that phrase, is not a rigid designator. The inventor of bifocals is not a rigid designator, but a name such as Richard Nixon is a rigid designator. So he says, if we apply this intuitive test to proper names, such as, for example, Richard Nixon, they would seem intuitively to come out as rigid designators. First, when we talk even about the counterfactual situation in which we suppose Nixon to have done things differently, we assume we're still talking about Nixon himself. It's not that we jump to, let me get my drawing tool again. It's not as if we jump to a world. All right, so this is before Watergate, but let's use Watergate, for example. So Nixon made lots of mistakes with Watergate. And you say, well, what would the Nixon presidency have looked like if he hadn't got embroiled in the Watergate scandal? All right, so that means you've got to be thinking about an alternative scenario in which something different happens from what actually happened. You do not go to this world and try to find a person with that name, Richard Nixon. Because of course, that might not be Nixon. I mean, you can attach the name Richard Nixon to anybody. So if you go to a possible world, say you want to go to a possible world where there is no Watergate scandal. Okay, there's a whole bunch of such worlds. Which one are you thinking about? Well, maybe there's not exactly one, but tell me what else you're looking for in that world. Do not say, I'm looking for a world where there's no Watergate scandal with somebody or other named Richard Nixon, who is president. That's not what you're doing. What you do is you go to a world. Let me erase this part. This is actually kind of fun with the little eraser. You go to a world where there's no Watergate scandal and has Richard Nixon in it. That's supposed to be an N. Doesn't actually look like one, does it? And Nixon is president. So basically, you try to pick a world with roughly the same history as the actual world up to the Watergate stuff, and then you keep Nixon out of that. But notice, it is the very same person in this world. And it doesn't matter if he's still named Richard Nixon or not. What matters is that it is Richard Nixon. So on the intuitive test that Kripke explained here, the name Richard Nixon comes out as a rigid designator. What that means is that's a term suitable for use in an identity statement. So what else could we put in there? Well, one of his nicknames was Tricky Dicky, which is kind of funny. So we could say Richard Nixon is identical to Tricky Dicky. And then by the argument above, that necessity would have, that identity would have to be necessary. Here's his second point about Nixon. We can't say Nixon might have been a different man from the man he in fact is. We could say that in the qualitative sense. If you mean by different man, just same man but different characteristics, in that sense, he could have been a different man from the man he in fact was. But in the numerical identity sense, Nixon couldn't have been a different person from the person he in fact is or was. Okay, so the first point is we learn something about identity. We learn what kinds of terms can be used in making identity statements, because identity statements have to be necessary if they're true at all, and that restricts what kinds of terms can flank the identity sign. And you're going to have proper names to do that. Second major point in the article is a way of sustaining some of the stuff that we just learned about. So go back to the list that we had of examples. Heat and mean molecular motion, those are not proper names. And you might want to know, are they suitable terms for use in identity claims? Because it certainly looks like scientists identify these two. They define or understand heat to be mean molecular motion. And you could do the same thing here, mind and brain state. Those aren't proper names. So proper names we know are suitable for use in making identity statements. But nothing Kripke said about rigid designation shows that only proper names are rigid designators. Maybe heat is one. Maybe this phrase, mean molecular motion, is one. Maybe mind is one. Maybe brain state is one. Okay, so how are we going to sort that out? Well, if you make the assumptions that the logical empiricists make and you endorse the proof, you're going to have to say heat really isn't the same thing as mean molecular motion. Mind really isn't the same thing as being in a certain brain state or collection of brain states, because those claims aren't analytic. And here comes the second part of Kripke's attack on the assumed background. Don't confuse necessity, analyticity, and a priority. Necessity falls within the arena of metaphysics. What's a priori falls within epistemology, and what's analytic falls within the philosophy of language. And this is probably the most earth-shaking part of the lectures that compose the book Naming and Necessity. Kripke is perfectly clear on this in a way that nobody else up to this point in the history of philosophy had been clear about. Prior to Kripke, people ran together each of these three distinctions. So when they'd talk about analyticity, they'd characterize it in terms of being a priori. And when they talk about necessity, sometimes they talk about the a priori and sometimes they talk about the analytic. And it's frustrating and confusing to find people do that. Okay, so let's make sure we just keep them clear, keep them cleanly distinguished from one another, and then it'll be an interesting and substantive question whether there are a priori claims that are not analytic, whether there are a posteriori claims that are nonetheless necessary, and so on. The degree to which the three sets of distinctions line up will be open for discussion, which is important for some of the examples that we saw earlier on the list. So if you're attracted to physicalist conceptions of the mind, you might want to identify the mind with the brain. But you clearly can't do that in terms of some analytic connection, and you clearly can't do it in terms of any a priori connection between mind and brain. And if you make logical empiricist assumptions, you're stuck. You can't have a necessary connection between the two, and thus, given Kripke's proof, you can't have an identity at all between the two. But once you break apart the three sets of distinctions, the topic is open for discussion again. Can there be necessities that are discoverable by science? For example, water is H2O. Is that really a necessity claim? Is it a truth? Well, if it's a true, is it an identity claim? It looks like an identity claim, and it certainly looks true. So, given Kripke's proof, it has to be a necessary truth. Same for heat and mean molecular motion. Maybe that is an identity claim. And if so, it will also have to be necessary. If it is necessary, it won't be a priori necessary. So there's going to be a posteriori necessities. And it is also clearly not analytic. So there will be synthetic necessities. Kant famously argued for the existence of such things, except he didn't talk about it in clear enough terms for people to know exactly what was going on in Kant. But this looks like a sort of vindication of a Kantian perspective about the relationships between necessity, analyticity, and the a priori. So that's a completely new and significant development that occurs for the first time out of Kripke's work on modal logic. Now, what happens later on in the article is once you break apart these three, the question of metaphysical essentialism comes back into the picture, together with the Quinean challenge that we looked at when we were talking about Rothbard and Marcus. So Kripke talks about that. We are going to be able to quantify in, and so we're going to have boxes that attach to predicates and not just boxes out in front of whole sentences. And that raises the specter of Aristotelian essentialism that Quine thought generated a contradiction. But the Quinean argument is guilty of confusing de dicto and de re modalities. So we don't need to be worried about it. But now we do need to start thinking about how do we figure out if there are such things as essential properties versus accidental ones, which are which. So Kripke is apparently standing in front of a lectern made of wood, an ordinary lectern, giving a lecture, and he points to his lectern and says, could this lectern have been made of ice? Now, that's not the same question as could there be a lectern made of ice? Obviously, there could be a lectern made of ice. But that's not what he's asking. He's asking, could this very lectern, this one, not some other one, but this one, have been made of ice? And Kripke's inclined to say no to that question. Now, if you're inclined to say no to that question, it would be nice to be able to tell a story as to why you think it couldn't be made of ice. And Kripke's idea is, well, if you're going to be inclined to say no, it couldn't have been made of ice, it will be because of the way this lectern came to be. So here's the story of how this lectern came to be. Somebody cut some wood, they cut it into boards. Somebody else took the boards, assembled them in the form of a lectern, which then got used as a lectern. And so maybe the lectern couldn't have been made of ice because the origins of this lectern are essential to it. All right, now that's an additional commitment beyond the mere commitment to the idea that some of the properties of a thing are essential to it and some of the properties are not. That's essentialism, full stop. The essentiality of origins is a useful addition to that to explain some intuitions that at least some people have. And the lectern example is supposed to be one of those. So you look at the lectern and you ask yourself, what's it made of? Well, it's made of wood. Could it have been made of something other than wood? Could it have been made of ice? Well, not if its origins are essential to it being the very lectern that it is. Now, more generally, that doesn't, whatever you say about the essentiality of origins doesn't commit you one way or another on the more general question about whether objects can have some of their properties essentially and others accidentally. Kripke thinks there is such a distinction. So did Aristotle think the same thing. And Kripke's argument for it is don't object to this by by confusing the a priori with the necessary. So Kripke says the a priori is one thing, that's epistemology. What's necessary is metaphysics, and that's another thing. So the fact that you have to do some science to figure out which are the essential properties of things doesn't show that the properties are not in fact essential. That would be to confuse the epistemology and the metaphysics. But the point is, when you look at 1 and 2, 2 is about essentialism properly understood. Is there a difference between an essential property and an accidental property? Do you and does every other object in the universe have some of its properties essentially and some non-essentially? Kripke's answer is yes. Now, try to figure out which are which. How do you do that? What would you be looking for? Well, if origins are essential to a thing, then you have one way of investigating which properties are essential to a thing. Now, maybe origins are essential and maybe they aren't. So think about your own origins. At some point, a particular sperm and egg united, and presumably the sperm and egg that united themselves came from 2 other people and so that sperm and egg could not have been the sperm and egg that they are had that sperm and egg not come from the particular people that are your parents. So now your parents are essential to you in virtue of the essentiality of origins. Okay, it's not just your parents, but it's also the particular sperm and egg. So suppose conception had occurred 6 months later, and the person born was in the same birth order position as you are and would be 6 months younger than you. Could that have been you? Well, I mean, you can try to preserve the possibility that it's you. You might be able to say, for example, yeah, but the particular sperm and egg didn't have to exist at the precise times that they existed. And so maybe the very same sperm and egg could have been joined 6 months later, and then it would have been me. Okay, maybe that's right. But there's some pressure on that view. For example, suppose, I don't know what you're going to think about this, but think about miscarriages and how they work. So suppose you have a family that has 3 kids, and between child number 1 and child number 2, there was a miscarriage. Suppose there hadn't been a miscarriage. What's the relationship between the actual second child and the world in which the actual second child, well, let me be careful. So in the actual world, there's a birth, a miscarriage, a birth, and a birth. Now go to a world in which we try to keep as much alike as we can. So the first birth is, we're going to stipulate, the same child as was born first. And the last child is the same one that was born last. But now, what about the relationship between the miscarriage and the second child being born? Suppose the second child being born was born when the miscarried child would have been born in the actual world. Is it then the same as the miscarried child or not? Could it have been the same? Well, I don't know the answer to any of these questions, but the essentiality of origins gives you a weapon for trying to make some decisions about cases like that. It's just that the essentiality of origins conflicts with some things that, at least in fiction, we talk about. So imagine having different parents than you actually have. Doesn't that seem like something that you could imagine? If the essentiality of origins is correct, it's not a possibility. You couldn't have had different parents than you in fact had. You couldn't have been born into a different family. So there's some tension between the essentiality of origins and various imaginable scenarios, at least. Maybe imaginable scenarios can be nonetheless impossible. But in any case, the point is the essentiality of origins is not part of essentialism as such. It's an additional commitment beyond merely a commitment to the idea that some properties of a thing are essential to it while others are merely accidental. Okay, then the lecture that you read talks a little bit about names, descriptions, and how descriptions, don't get confused between descriptions and names, even though we often fix the referent of a name by a description. So we tell you who we're talking about by using a description, but that doesn't mean that the content of the name is given by the description itself. So this is Kripke's famous attack on the descriptional theory of names. And if you go back and look at Frege and Russell in particular, remember for Frege, various terms, names in particular, even things like Hesperus and Phosphorus, things that denoting expressions had to express senses. And every time Frege talks about a sense, he gives you a description, a definite description, right? So Abraham, who is Abraham? And when you answer that question, you will give a description. And that can often incline you to think, well, that's the meaning of the name. And the same thing for Russell. Russell became so convinced that you had to replace names with descriptions that he ended up thinking there really aren't, I mean, there are names, but they can't have descriptive content if they're going to play a role as names in his philosophy of language. So it turned out there's only two names, this and that. All the rest, you should just replace the name with its descriptive content. This section of Kripke's lecture is devoted to undermining the descriptional theory of names. So you start with the idea that first, your descriptive content might be mistaken. So he uses the example of Gödel and, oh, what's the guy's name? That Schmidt, was that it? Schmidt? Let's say it's Schmidt. I don't know if that's it, but suppose Gödel stole the incompleteness theorem from Schmidt, and then the descriptional theory of names is endorsed with respect to the name Kurt Gödel. And then it turns out whenever you say Gödel discovered the incompleteness of arithmetic, you are speaking the truth in spite of the fact that we set up the story so that he stole it. Okay, that's bad enough. Another bad thing is cases where you don't really have a definite description. You don't know enough about the person. So who's Hezekiah? Maybe you actually know which king of ancient Israel Hezekiah is. I don't, at this moment, remember enough about it, except that he's called Hezekiah. So what do I know about Hezekiah? I'm talking about Hezekiah, and you say, who the hell is Hezekiah? And I say, oh, he's one of those ancient kings of Israel. Well, that doesn't pick him out. It doesn't make me be referring to the one guy in virtue of the descriptional content I gave you, as opposed to many of the other ancient kings of Israel. So sometimes we don't know enough about the individual to even give a definite description with respect to them. And so Kripke's position is the descriptional theory of names has to be wrong. Names are not cognitively significant because they express descriptive content. Instead, the descriptive content plays the role of fixing the reference, and then the name takes on a semantic life of its own. Now, at this point, Kripke hedges a bit. He says, I don't have a theory of what the semantic content of names is. But there are some possibilities. He talks about the causal historical theory, where names acquire their semantic significance by being linked to some original baptism of the object with that name. Now, and he says that's not a theory, it's just a picture. I think the reason he said that is because if it were a theory, it's not that hard to find counterexamples to it. So one of my favorite is the island of Madagascar, which is off the east coast of Africa. Madagascar was originally introduced as a name for the African mainland on that side of Africa. And then I forget who it was that landed on the island. Maybe it was Marco Polo. Anyway, some traveler landed on the island thinking he was on the mainland and kept referring to where he was as Madagascar. And somehow in the process of all of this, Madagascar, the word, came to refer to the island, not the mainland. Well, the causal historical theory has a hard time explaining how that could have happened. In fact, it looks like it's incompatible with that. Madagascar should still be referring to the mainland because we are in a long causal chain from the original baptism where it was attached to the African mainland. Okay, so there's lots of complexities. The other picture is John Stuart Mill's view was that names are nothing but referring expressions. All they do is tag objects. There's no semantic content of any sort except the individual so named. That looks closer to something Kripke is after, but it does explain, it does have a hard time with some of the examples that we've been using. Like when I talk about Lois Lane and who she loves and Lois Lane and who she wishes would come save her, if names are nothing but tags, we shouldn't find a difference in our reaction when we say she's hoping Clark Kent comes to save her. And you balk at that and you say, no, that's not what she's hoping for. She's hoping for Superman to come save her. And I say, oh, but names are just tags for objects. So it doesn't matter which name I pick. And there's a sense in which it does matter which name you pick in the Lois Lane example. When you bury the name in an opaque context, like under the mental state of a person who is not fully cognizant of all the identities that there are in the world, then it ends up that it does seem to make a difference of some sort. So you have to say something about that. In any case, the implications here for how to understand names is one of the major impressive accomplishments of the Kripke lectures. So we have four things. We have the identity, the necessity of identity point and its implications. We have, second, the clear distinctions between necessity, analyticity, and a prioricity, the way in which that opens room for essentialism and the doing of serious metaphysics once again, and now the philosophy of language stuff about the role of names and naming in a proper understanding of language. Okay, those are the major accomplishments. And then right at the end of the paper, we get Kripke talking a bit for the first time about the philosophy of mind, which he hadn't said anything about before. And it's kind of a throwaway example, except if you're a physicalist. And remember, if the 20th century, if anything is true about the 20th century, it's that scientific naturalism is the view that um, most aspire to defend. And the easiest way to do that is to be a physicalist about the mind. And then whatever you're going to say about language, you're going to have to say something there. But suppose you do want to be a physicalist about the mind. It doesn't matter exactly what version of physicalism you want to defend. There are several ones on offer that you might think about. But Kripke here is going to go after you if you are inclined to be a physicalist. Because if you look back at our original list of possible candidates for contingent identities, there were two on this list: the connection between heat and mean molecular motion, and the connection between mind and brain. And Kripke's going to say those are dramatically different connections. And that's the last part of the article. He thinks, even though heat can be identified with mean molecular motion, that's not going to help somebody who wants to identify mind and brain. So that's the final part of the Kripke article. So let's take a look at it. So here's what we do. How is it that, in spite of the fact that it's not analytic or knowable a priori, that heat is the same thing as mean molecular motion, how could it be that they are in fact the same thing and necessarily so? Here's what he says. We explain the possibility of heat not being mean molecular motion in terms of epistemic possibility of some sort. Before investigation, it was in some sense an epistemic possibility that heat turned out to be something else. In other words, we can put it this way. It was compatible with everything we knew at the time that heat was not mean molecular motion. But it turns out we found out otherwise. So what used to be an epistemic possibility is no longer an epistemic possibility, because we found out that it's a necessary truth that heat turned out to be something else. Okay, so that's the story about mean molecular motion perhaps not being heat. Can we say the same thing about mind-body relations? In other words, can we appeal to the notion of epistemic possibility to explain the possibility that the mind and body are not the same in a way that leaves the identity capable of being endorsed? Can we do that? Kripke is skeptical. He says, but the way we identify pain is by feeling it. And if a C fiber stimulation could have occurred without our feeling any pain, then the C fiber stimulation would have occurred without there being any pain. The trouble is that although heat is a rigid designator, heat is picked out by the contingent property of its being felt in a certain way. Pain, on the other hand, is picked out by an essential, indeed necessary, and sufficient property. For a sensation to be felt as a pain, I added a word, for a sensation to be felt as pain is for it to be pain. Okay, so the epistemic possibility for heat is this: heat, epistemic access to heat through sensation, and then this sensation could have been present while mean molecular motion wasn't. That's the epistemic possibility in question. And that's so even though heat is necessarily the same thing as mean molecular motion, but you can't separate pain from the feeling of pain in this way. So you can't explain away the possibility of pain not being C fiber firing in the same way, precisely because you can separate heat from the sensation or experience of heat, but you can't separate pain from the experience of pain. All right, so that means Kripke thinks there's something about pain and the essential connection between being in pain and experiencing pain that prevents you from giving the same explanation as you gave in the case of heat and mean molecular motion. As a result, Kripke holds you cannot identify mind with brain. You can't identify a mental state with a brain state. it's a different sort of thing. And notice this, again, is a metaphysical challenge to the logical empiricism of the Vienna Circle up through Carnap, because they wanted a version of scientific naturalism. And any form of anti-physicalism about the mind is going to be a threat to that view. Now, if you give up the mind-brain identity theory, there are still lots of physicalist accounts of the relationship between mind and brain. There are behaviorist versions of physicalism or naturalism. There are functionalist accounts of physicalism or naturalism. But Kripke's point is he doesn't think you're going to be able to defend the identity theory any longer. Now, notice, I mean, this is going to be a controversial topic, right? So there's going to be lots of literature on Kripke's argument for rejecting the identity theory. And there are more recent versions of an argument like this that appeal to the distinction between epistemic possibility and metaphysical possibility to sustain the view that you cannot identify mind and brain. David Chalmers, for example, is famous for defending an argument of this sort. The first person to defend an argument of this sort is, of course, Descartes. Descartes thought there was something special about the mind that prevented it from being identified with any particular physical thing. And the thing that was special about the mind had to do with this distinction between metaphysical and epistemic possibility. If you're interested in that sort of thing, we haven't talked much about the philosophy of mind, but you could investigate arguments like this for your paper as well as other things. But in any case, that's the last of our discussion of the rise and fall of analytic philosophy. By the time you're done with Kripke, this Naming Necessity was published in, well, it wasn't published until 1980, but the lectures occurred in 1969 or 1970. So I say by the time we get to 1970, analytic philosophy is dead. There's no longer any assumption being made that you start with the philosophy of language when you're investigating the connections between mind, world, and language. And once you're into the 70s, people will start with ontology. They will start with epistemology. So M&E comes back as the fundamental questions to address in philosophy, and you don't address those by asking about the meaning of terms. Instead, you get something like Keith Lehrer's attitude in his book, Knowledge, from 1977. He says, I'm not interested in what the word knows means or how it functions in language. I'm interested in knowledge itself, its scope, limits, and nature. It is the phenomenon itself, not the words or the meaning of the words, that drives the investigation. And since the demise of analytic philosophy by 1970, that has come to be a common theme. People are interested in the phenomena themselves, not the terms by which we talk about the phenomena.